Hello. In this short lecture, I will be talking about the complexity of the Australian cultural identity. Australia's contemporary culture has been shaped by the diversity of the people living here, their lifestyle, their stories, and of course, by the history of this country. This has meant that precisely what constitutes the Australian cultural identity is quite complex. There's the continuity of the culture of Australia's Indigenous population, their deep connection to the land, their spirituality and enduring customs. Then there's the colonisation of Australia by the British, the adoption of British political institutions, British law, British cultural values. And then finally, there's the extensive immigration from so many different countries. All of this comes together to create a country with a unique flavour. It's a flavour that is changeable as new waves of people come. This means that exactly what it means to be Australian is also changeable. So it's precisely what we would call the Australian cultural identity is very complex indeed. Bringing together this diversity of different cultures can be challenging, yet Australia has managed it amazingly well. There has been little conflict between the different cultures. This is despite the people coming from places that continue to be torn by conflict. It's something that needs to be worked out, of course, and encouraging migrants to take up Australian citizenship is one way to do it. According to the Department of Home Affairs, Australian citizenship is a shared identity, a common bond which unites all Australians while respecting our diversity. It's this diversity that is highlighted as the most important aspect of Australian culture. At school, we are taught that Australia is one of the most successful multicultural countries in the world. Here's a quote from the Australian government website, Our Country. Australian culture is as broad and varied as the country's landscape. Australia is multicultural and multiracial, and this is reflected in the country's food, lifestyle and cultural practices and experience. Australia has an important heritage from its Indigenous people, which plays a defining role in the cultural landscape. This diversity of influences creates a cultural environment in Australia that is lively, energised, innovative, and outward-looking. Australia's cultural environment has not always been this way, of course, despite the obvious fact that there were people living here occupying the land, managing the land, caring for the country. The British declared it terra nullius, a legal fiction that formed the basis of the British takeover of the land. With the centrality of caring for country to Aboriginal people's sense of well-being, the heart of Australia was broken. Repairing the damage is a long-term project Australia has not fully reconciled as yet. Despite claiming Australia for the crown, the British hold over the vast continent of Australia was initially very tenuous. By 1901, when Australia became a nation state, there were less than 4 million Europeans living here. Nervous about Australia's location on the edge of vastly populated Asia, the very first Act of Parliament was to legislate to ensure that it remained a white Australia, a British Australia. Immigration from anywhere other than Britain was virtually curtailed. Australians considered themselves both Australian and British, a dual identity that some cling to today. It's been these strong ties to its British roots that has determined Australia's foreign policy, including involvement in war on foreign shores. And it's this experience of war that made Australia realise it needed to populate in order to be able to protect itself. And so a great wave of immigration began with Europeans whose homes had been destroyed in the war. Australia's population grew rapidly from 7 million in 1940 to 10 million in 1960. Here's a picture of migrant workers on the Snowy Mountains hydroelectricity scheme. Australian cultures began to change despite significant efforts by the government to retain the dominance of British Australian culture. Here's a picture of a Greek cafe in Melbourne, the beginning of the rich and vibrant cafe culture that is a quintessential part of Melbourne today. Non-Europeans, however, remained largely restricted from immigrating to Australia, but that was all to change in the 1970s. Anti-discrimination laws were introduced and the White Australia policy was replaced with the policy of multiculturalism. People immigrating to Australia no longer had to give up their language and culture and assimilate into the prevailing British Australian culture. Diversity was to be embraced and celebrated. People would be integrated into the wider Australian society, and Australian society would adapt and adopt some of their culture as well. And so to summarise, I'll cite Professor Julianne Schultz. She says Australian culture has 4 distinctive characteristics. Firstly, its Indigenous history, home to the longest continuous living civilisations. Secondly, Australia is one of the most successful continuous representative democracies. The third characteristic relates to the fact that interstate war has never been fought on Australian soil. Australia has never been invaded. Peace is probably one of the main reasons so many people have been attracted to the idea of immigrating to Australia. That and the fact that a country of just 25 million people can be the 14th richest country in the world. It's not just our history, of course, that has led to Australia being such a successful nation. It's also about our geography. Australia's location in the Asia-Pacific region has also had a real influence on our prosperity, on our peacefulness, and also on who has come to our shores to become a major part of a modern Australian culture. I'm Diane Colman. Thanks for listening.